January 21st, 1793. A man wakes up before dawn. Not in a palace, in a prison cell. The room is cold, the walls sweat. He's dressed like a citizen now, not a king. A plain coat, simple stockings, no crown. Outside, Paris is already moving. Not toward markets, toward a scaffold. He can hear it in the distance. The city doesn't sound like a celebration. It sounds like a mechanism turning. This is Louis au Capet. That's what they call him now. Not your majesty, not most Christian king. Just a surname, a downgrade made official. In a few hours, the French Revolution will do something Europe has spent centuries pretending couldn't happen. It will put a king on trial like a criminal, and execute him like one. And the part most people miss is this. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a mob moment. It was paperwork, votes, procedure. A sentence built line by line so every throne in Europe would understand one thing. If a king can be reduced to a man, then every king is negotiable. For generations, the Bourbon monarchy didn't just rule France. It organized reality. Law came from the crown. Taxes flowed upward. Titles flowed downward. The king wasn't only political power. He was sacred structure, coronation oil, cathedral ritual. A story that said France existed because God approved it. And for a long time, people lived inside that story. Because the palace was bright, and hunger was far away. Versailles was mirrors, fountains, music, silk. Paris was breadlines, rent, cold rooms, debt. The kingdom could carry that contradiction, until one thing broke. Not morality, not loyalty, math. By the late 1780s, France was drowning in numbers. War debts from fighting Britain. Interest payments eating the treasury alive. A tax system built to protect the powerful and squeeze the desperate. Nobles and clergy with exemptions. Common people with the bill. And then the harvests failed. Bad weather, bad grain. Bread prices climbed until a loaf cost wages. That's when a political crisis becomes a survival crisis. Because you can ignore philosophy. You can't ignore hunger. Louis XVI wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't even especially cruel. He was something more dangerous in a collapsing system. Indecisive. A man built for routine, who inherited a machine that needed surgery. His ministers tried reforms. They failed. They tried new taxes. They got blocked. They tried borrowing more. The lenders began saying no. So, in 1789, the crown did something it hadn't done in generations. It called the Estates General, a meeting that was supposed to raise money, but accidentally raised a question. Who owns the country? The estates were a hierarchy made physical. First estate, clergy. Second estate, nobility. Third estate, everyone else. 90-something% of France. They arrived with lists of grievances, taxes, rights, justice, bread. And they realized something the monarchy never wanted them to realize. They were the majority. So they demanded votes by head, not by estate. Because by estate, the first two could always outvote them. By head, the third estate could become power. Louis hesitated. Hesitation in a crisis reads like contempt. The third estate declared itself the National Assembly. Then they swore an oath in a tennis court. They would not disband until France had a constitution. A king could ignore a petition. He couldn't ignore a new government forming inside his own government. Paris watched the standoff like weather building. And then the pressure released. July the 14th, 1789. A crowd moved toward the Bastille, not because it held many prisoners. It didn't. Because it was a symbol. A fortress that said the state could swallow you. and never explain why. They fought, they bled, they took it, and when the governor's head went on a pike, it wasn't just violence, it was a message. The monarchy's fear no longer worked. Versailles tried to pretend it was temporary. The court kept eating, kept dancing, kept acting like Paris was a noise in the distance. But in October, hunger walked straight into the palace. Thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles. They wanted bread. They wanted the king to see them. They wanted the royal family moved to Paris, not as guests, as hostages. By the end of the days, the monarchy had been relocated, not defeated yet, but contained. And inside that containment, the royal family began shrinking. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, and the crushing awareness that the old world was leaking away. Marie Antoinette became the symbol people loved to hate. Foreign-born, Austrian, associated with luxury whether she deserved it or not. Pamphlets turned her into a monster, a caricature. And propaganda does something important in revolutions. It makes mercy feel like betrayal. Louis tried to cooperate and survive. He accepted reforms. He signed constitutional changes. But he also did something that turned suspicion into certainty. June 1791. The royal family attempted to flee. A quiet escape planned like a private trip. Carriages, disguises, a route toward the eastern border, where loyal forces could protect them. It failed at Varennes. Recognized, stopped, brought back to Paris under watch. And that moment rewired the relationship. Because now the king wasn't just struggling. He was leaving. Not a father of the nation, a man trying to abandon it. After Varennes, every decision looked like deception. Every delay looked like plotting. And then Europe leaned in. Foreign monarchs watched France and saw contagion. Because if French subjects could rewrite their country, why couldn't others? Threats formed, alliances moved. War became inevitable. And war always radicalizes a revolution. Because in war, compromise looks like weakness, and weakness feels like death. August 10th, 1792. Paris didn't debate monarchy anymore. It attacked it. The Tuileries Palace was stormed. Swiss guards slaughtered. The king was suspended. Then imprisoned. Then relabeled. Louis Capet. Citizen Capet. A royal identity stripped down to something arrestable. And now the revolution did the thing that made it a warning. Instead of a riot, it built a legal case. Because a lynching creates martyrs. A trial creates precedent. Because the revolution understood something most mobs don't. If you kill a king in anger, you create a martyr. If you kill him by process, you create permission. So they didn't rush. They organized. They turned regicide into a meeting agenda. They drafted charges like a ledger. They hunted for paper trails. Letters, decrees, notes from the palace. Anything that could be held up and called proof. And then they did the part that changed the world. They made the decision public. Not the revolution has decided. Not Paris has demanded. They made individual men say it out loud. A roll call, one by one. Deputies standing up in front of everyone and declaring what should happen to a king. Because once you force a room full of lawmakers to speak the sentence, you bind them to it. You make retreat impossible. Some tried to soften it. Exile, imprisonment, a national referendum, anything that could delay the blade. But delay was the enemy now. Because the longer Louis lived, the longer France had a symbol that could be rescued. And a rescued king becomes a restored king. So the revolution did what a threatened state always does. It chose the outcome that removes options. And what's chilling is how calm it was. No screaming requirement, no mob vote, just an institution declaring, in legal language, that the person who used to be France was now simply guilty. And that means something, because one's guilt applies to a king, then divinity doesn't. The National Convention charged Louis with treason, not abstract treason, specific acts, conspiring against liberty, inviting foreign intervention, bloodshed against the people. They presented documents. They debated articles. They voted. And that vote mattered more than the blade, because it meant the king's body was no longer protected by myth. He could be sentenced by men who used to bow. When the result came, it wasn't unanimous. Some wanted exile. Some wanted imprisonment. Some wanted mercy to prove France was civilized. But the majority chose death. And once a government chooses death by vote, it teaches a lesson to every ruler watching. Your crown is not armor. It's a target. On the morning of January 21st, Louis was taken to the Place de la Révolution, a square that used to honor monarchy, now rebranded for its execution. The streets were lined with soldiers, because even the revolution feared the crowd. He tried to speak. He tried to declare innocence. The drums drowned him out. A deliberate choice. Not chaos, control. Then the blade fell. And the world changed in a single second. And what happened next matters. Because the blade didn't only cut flesh, it cut the contract. The old world ran on an assumption. A king could lose battles, lose provinces, even lose power. But the institution of monarchy stayed intact. France shattered that assumption in public. On a schedule, with guards in formation, with officials checking names, with a machine designed to make death look clean. And Europe felt the shock immediately, because this wasn't just an execution. This was a precedent that could spread. If you are a monarch watching from another capital, you don't see Louis is dead. You see the spell is broken. Because people had always been able to imagine rebellion. They hadn't been able to imagine legitimacy shifting. That's why the reaction wasn't just outrage. It was containment. Borders hardening. Alliances tightening. Armies moving like doors slamming shut. And inside France, the execution didn't bring peace. It raised the stakes. Because once you kill the king, you can't negotiate with monarchy anymore. You can only defeat it. So the revolution's logic changed. Before it was reform, a constitution, a new balance. After, it became survival. And survival has a habit of demanding enemies. Because kings had died before, assassinated, overthrown, killed in battle. But this was different. This was a public, legal execution carried out by the state against the state's former head. It was a declaration that sovereignty had moved from bloodline to majority. And every monarch in Europe understood the implication immediately. If France could do it to Louis XVI, it could happen anywhere. But the warning didn't stop at Louis, because a revolution doesn't feel safe until the old future is impossible. And as long as the royal family lived, someone could imagine restoration. Marie Antoinette remained, and in 1793 she was moved to the Conciergerie, a prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Her world narrowed into stone corridors, guards, interrogations, hostile stares. She was no longer a queen to be insulted. She was evidence. The charges against her weren't only political. They were designed to destroy sympathy. Accusations of treason, accusations of conspiracy with Austria, and then the ugliest charge of all, incest with her son, a claim meant to poison even the idea of compassion. Because revolutions don't just execute bodies, they execute reputations. Because that's the second blade. The first one kills the body. The second one kills sympathy. And Marie Antoinette wasn't just a prisoner. She was a problem the revolution needed to solve. A living queen invites rescue. A living queen invites foreign flags. A living queen invites people to whisper, "Wait, maybe this can be undone." So the revolution didn't only lock her away. It rebranded her, not as a rival, as a criminal. And that's why the accusations went beyond politics. Because treason can still sound noble to the wrong audience. But moral disgust closes the door. They wanted the public to feel something specific. Not sadness, not doubt. They wanted revulsion. And this is where it gets darkest. Because the revolution used the child. Louis Charles wasn't just a boy in a cell. He was a symbol with a pulse. A future king that existed simply by being alive. So they isolated him. They pressed him. They made him repeat stories. They turned a child's words into a weapon that could be read in court. And even if you never look at a single document from that time, you can feel the intention. They weren't trying to discover truth. They were trying to remove sympathy from the equation. Because sympathy leads to hesitation. And hesitation is how monarchies survive. So when Marie Antoinette finally stood in that courtroom, the verdict was already built. Not by evidence, by narrative. And the moment she was executed, the revolution didn't just remove a person. It removed a rallying point. Her trial moved fast. Witnesses, testimony, a verdict that was never in doubt. October 16th, 1793. She was taken to the same blade, not in a royal carriage, in an open cart, her hair cut, her hands bound, the city watching the fall of a symbol. And when she died, it wasn't just vengeance. It was strategy. Because as long as she lived, foreign armies could claim they fought for her. Now there was no queen to restore. But the most chilling part of what happened to the royal family isn't Louis. It isn't Marie Antoinette. It's what happened to the children. The revolution understood something brutal. If you want the old regime to stop coming back, you don't just remove the current king. You erase the next one. The royal children were held in the Temple prison, a medieval fortress turned into a cage. Louis Charles, the Dauphin, a child who, in the eyes of royalists, became Louis XVII the moment his father died. And that title made him dangerous, not because he could lead, but because others could lead in his name. So they separated him from his mother, then from his sister. They isolated him. They placed him under education, which in practice meant neglect, coercion, and a slow collapse of health and mind. A child turned into a political object. He lived in filth. He weakened. He became a rumor more than a person. In June 1795, he died in captivity, 10 years old. Not executed in public, but destroyed quietly, so the revolution wouldn't have to explain itself. And that's a different kind of warning, because it tells the world the revolution wasn't only willing to kill a king, it was willing to kill the future. There was also Madame Elizabeth, Louis XVI's sister, a woman known for charity and piety, the kind of royal figure who might have been spared in another timeline. She wasn't spared. May 1794. She went to the guillotine too. Because when fear becomes policy, innocence doesn't matter. Association does. Only one immediate member of that close family survived. Marie-Thérèse, their daughter. She didn't survive because the revolution softened. She survived because she was useful, a prisoner to trade, a symbol to bargain with. She was eventually exchanged and sent out of France, alive but permanently shaped by what she watched disappear. So what was the warning? It wasn't simply revolutions are violent. Europe already knew violence. The warning was this: a modern state can dismantle monarchy without needing a rival king, without needing a conquering empire. It can do it internally, with legitimacy created by committees, votes, and laws. The French Revolution didn't just kill royals. It introduced a template, a new possibility. That sovereignty could be moved, and once moved, defended with terror. Because after the king died, France didn't calm down. It accelerated. War on the borders, civil war inside, famine, paranoia, betrayal. And out of that pressure came the terror, a period where the revolution began consuming its own. Trials became faster, evidence became thinner, suspicion became enough. The guillotine stopped being an event and became a schedule. Europe watched, and rulers reacted in two ways. Some tried repression, crack down harder, censor more, police thought. Others tried reform, change just enough to stop the fuse from lighting. Because France had shown what happened when a state loses legitimacy and tries to hold power with tradition alone. And here's the deeper warning. The monarchy didn't die because of one mistake. It died because it couldn't adapt fast enough to a society that had changed underneath it. Louis XVI tried half measures, half reforms, half promises, half control. And in a crisis, half control looks like weakness to your enemies and betrayal to your allies. The revolution learned the opposite lesson: full commitment, total transformation, no reversible outcomes. That's why the royal family mattered, not as people, as the last bridge back to the old world. So the revolution burned the bridge, in public, and then salted the ground behind it. When Louis died, monarchies across Europe didn't just mourn. They panicked, because they realized the problem wasn't France alone. The problem was the idea France had proven, that a king can be renamed, that a queen can be prosecuted, that a child can be neutralized, that sacred authority can be made secular, with enough hunger, enough debt, enough anger, and the right political machine to aim it. The French Revolution didn't just destroy a royal family. It demonstrated a method that would echo through the next century. In uprisings, in constitutions, in restorations, and in the constant fear that the crowd outside the palace gates might someday become the government inside. Because the guillotine wasn't the warning was the vote that sent them there. The paperwork that turned a king into a condemned man. The calm, procedural way. A world-old structure was made removable. And once the world learned that lesson, it never unlearned it. This is Wacky History, where history isn't polished for comfort. Subscribe if you want the pattern behind then events. Not just what happened, but why it kept happening.